Madam, we can start the program.
Okay.
Madam, we can start the class.
Okay. My voice is audible.
Yes, it's audible.
Okay. Okay. So, a very good morning to one and all. It's a Sunday morning, and it's just pre-Diwali. So, the topic is also very interesting. I have been allotted four chapters from your syllabus, and there are different forms of therapy. So, what I have tried to do is I have tried to maybe divide the 2 hour class today into maybe 30-minute sessions each, and maybe we can take a break at the end of 30 minutes after we complete one chapter, right? So I'm open to take questions as and when they come. But the first and the last chapter are perhaps a little bit more important conceptually. So I'll be spending a little bit more time there, and the middle two chapters will be maybe 20 minutes each, right? Okay. So the first part of the talk that I'm going to talk about is psychoanalysis and psychodynamic therapy. So that is one of the most interesting forms of therapy. And when we say no matter whatever form of therapy you do, right, um, you cannot just do without understanding what is it that makes a person the way he or she is, right? So psychoanalysis is particularly trying to understand the deeper aspects of a person and how to do it, who started understanding it, who gave the concepts. So I'll be talking about each of it. So it starts with this quote. I really find it interesting. So until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Okay. So that's by Carl Jung, who is also one of the pioneers in psychoanalysis. So what we'll be talking about today is okay. The slides are not moving from here, so I'll try and go here. Okay. Yes. So the learning objectives for the first part of the session will be to understand the core Freudian concepts, understand what are the defense mechanisms, apply transference and countertransference techniques, and maybe master some of the psychodynamic techniques that we usually involve in psycho therapy. So the relevance is this is perhaps the first systematic psychotherapy approach, and the concepts that were framed then have been used across all modalities of the existing therapies. And the primary utility today stays in understanding relationships and personality. The father of psychoanalysis is Dr. Sigmund Freud, and uh, when he started giving this concept, so he started saying that there are only two principles based on which any person lives, right? The first is the instinct to live, or life instincts, and that is called the eros. And if that is not there, it is death, right? So death instincts or the thanatos. So it's started with eros and thanatos. So this dual instinct theory, how we can conceptualize it, and what does eros stand for? It's like maybe the need to exist, for example, having sex, nurturance, and affiliation. And thanatos is the instinct for aggression towards self, like for example, self-criticism, which can result in depression, or maybe aggression towards others, where we have a lot of anger, jealousy, prejudice, and all of that. So that is where Freud started. And if we see how it manifests today, so Eros can be seen primarily being responsible for procreation, for social cooperation, for survival, and Thanatos being resulting in risky behavior, relieving trauma and aggression. So that was the principle based on which he conceptualized it further. And he said there's the three states of awareness. Everything that we do today, the thoughts that are going on inside our mind right now, what we are perceiving right now. For example, I see the wall, I hear, or I'm talking right now. So whatever I'm doing right now, and the thoughts and the perceptions that are actively there are my conscious state, that I'm actively aware about it, right? And just beneath the conscious layer is something called the preconscious, which although I'm not actively thinking about, but it is definitely there in my brain, stored as memory. And with little effort, I will be able to retrieve it. For example, if you ask me who's the, or maybe what did I have for breakfast yesterday, what did I have for dinner yesterday, and what happened around dinner. So maybe that is something which is stored in my memory, and I'll be able to retrieve it with little efforts. That is the preconscious state. And deep within is the unconscious state, and it's primarily more of instincts, more of fears, and more of selfish motives. For example, every day, for example, if I wake up in the morning and I just start my day without maybe having breakfast, for example. So I don't think about it much, but perhaps there could be an instinct that maybe I'll gain fat if I have breakfast. So maybe a lot of my behavior will be driven not focusing on the morning meal, so as to avoid whatever is my unconscious content, right? So that is where the unconscious or the vast unconscious stays, and there are a lot of books. Uh, I think each and every the one chapter of unconsciousness or delving into it can be a book itself, or maybe can be a 3 day workshop per se, or even a week. So understanding the unconscious is that deep, and the techniques also are very intensive, right? So Freud also laid down a structure of the human psyche. For example, uh, conscious, preconscious, and unconscious is what we are aware of, right? And the structure of the human psyche is how is it organized. For example, Freud said there are three states of existing. One is the id, one is the ego, one is the superego. So it is like the instincts within me. For example, there's a burger out there and I want to have it, right? The superego is like the father figure in us or the morality inside us, and it will say, no, no, don't have it now. The class is ongoing. Have it after the class. We don't eat between studies or something like that. And ego is the one who regulates what the it says and what the superego says and does what it's supposed to do. And what we actually do in reality is what our ego does, right? So yes, so it is. I want that right now. Superego says good people don't think about those things. For example, you can talk about all the substances that are there today, or all the pleasure principles that derive us. For example, your teacher is being abusive to you, and you want to hit back at the teacher. So it says, "I want to get back." Right? The superego says, "Good people or good students don't think about those things," and the ego says, "Let's figure out a way together." So that is how this kind of conflict and conflict resolution keep happening always, and that is how you function. So your ego makes you who you are. And what happens is, because as you can see, the id and superego, they're extremely conflicting in what they want to say and what they want to do and what is the primary core essence of it. So there is always an intrapsychic conflict that keeps going. We can see here is the id, that is the green circle, and then the left is the superego. And the intrapsychic conflict keeps happening always. And that results in a lot of anxiety. For example, the id itself can give you a lot of anxiety, and the superego in conflict with the id will also give you a lot of anxiety, right? So what the ego does to protect itself from it is something called as the defense mechanisms, right? So all of this ego, superego, the ego is something that we are aware of. It's more in the consciousness, although some part of it can be in the unconscious or preconscious state. But the id and superego are usually in the unconscious mind. We do not actually think about all of that conflict. Sometimes you might be seeing some movies and anime characters where there are two minds inside us. One is the good angel and the other is the devil, and they keep fighting. You do this, no, you don't do that. So that kind of a conflict is usually a representation of the id and superego and the fight that or the conflict that goes on inside our psyche all the time, right? So when we talk about the ego defense mechanisms, which is basically to protect the ego, it is seen to be of four levels. The highest level, which is considered the mature defense mechanisms or the healthy defense mechanisms, they are supposed to keep you healthy and allow you to cope with stressful emotions without distorting reality. So there are two bases, like two x and y axis, for example, based on which we classify this particular classification. And based on the developmental maturity, if the developmental maturity is high, and on the right side you see the distortion of reality is low, that is where the mature defense mechanisms work. Similarly, if you go to a lower level, it's neurotic, and then even if it is further reality distorting and developmental maturity is further low, it's immature, and the last level is pathological. The pathological defenses are also called psychotic defense mechanisms. So I tried to find out a comprehensive picture where all of the defense mechanisms are there together, but I did not find out a very good one. So this is a snapshot from my one of my textbooks. So I apologize for all the highlighting and all of that, but that's also helpful. So I thought I'll put it across. So the defense mechanisms can be classified into on the left extreme is the narcissist or the psychotic defense mechanisms, which are the pathological defense mechanisms. Then is the mature, then neurotic, and then mature. So, what are the narcissistic and psychotic defenses? It's DDP. That's the mnemonic that I used to remember. So, it's D for denial, D for distortion, and P for projection. So, I'll not be talking about each of the defense mechanisms in particular because I don't think if I complete all of it, I'll be able to complete whatever I'm supposed to cover otherwise. So, I'll be talking about the primary and the more commonly used defense mechanisms. So, for example, I'll give you a few examples later. So denial is when I don't accept what is reality. For example, it's very commonly seen in maybe grief or those kind of reactions where if someone dies and the first stage you say is someone dies and no, it cannot be true. So that is the denial that is coming up, right? And distortion is where you distort the reality and present it otherwise, which is usually seen in psychotic mechanisms. For example, um, there's a patient who is schizophrenic and the mother is trying to give him medications, right? So this person will project or distort the reality, saying that this my mother is trying to kill me with the medications. So there is a distortion of the reality. So that is one of the psychotic defense mechanisms. Similarly, there is projection. Projection is, for example, it's usually commonly seen in also psychotic disorders, where a person may be projecting their own insecurities on outside on someone else. For example, if a person feels that perhaps I'm not able to keep my wife happy. So, right. So, what it will say is perhaps my wife is infidel, like she is going out somewhere else, and he will project his inner um, insecurities on the wife, and that is how projection works, where you keep the blame on someone else, right? So, trying to understand in terms of day-to-day mechanisms, where it is not actually a defense mechanism, but more of maybe a behavior problem is for example, a bad worker blames his tools. That can be a good example of projection, right? Similarly, when we are talking about immature defense mechanisms, it's blocking and projection, passive aggressive behavior, acting out, hypochondriasis, regression, schizoid fantasy, and somatization. I'll talk about a few of it. For example, acting out. Acting out behavior is something like, for example, a lot of adolescents do. Um, right now, I want something. And if they're denied it, they just start shouting, howling, screaming. So it's more of an acting out behavior that is what they're manifesting, which is one of the immature defense mechanisms, right? What happens is regression is uh, an adult who is supposedly supposed to be a bit more mature and maybe um, more aware that he's not supposed to cry in front of strangers and stuff, and suddenly there's something like the car breaks down. So at that point of time, as an adult, you're expected to sort out the problem. It's like a problem-solving strategy is what is expected of you. So instead, if you start sitting on the road and start crying about it without doing anything, so it's possibly a regressive behavior where you're crying like a child, where you are supposed to be handling the problem rather than just sitting and crying, right? So that is one of the ways of regression. Somatization is where you have a lot of stress and you're not able to sort it out. Maybe you start having headaches, you start having stomach aches, you start having aches here and there, where you have somatic symptoms because of your unconscious conflicts. That is somatization. Hypochondriasis is where you start believing you have a particular illness or a serious illness. Possibly I have cancer, that is why I'm not feeling like eating and all of that. Where you attribute to having a serious medical condition. Passive aggressive behavior is commonly seen I would say more commonly in boyfriend girlfriend relationships. Yeah, so you're angry on your partner, and what happens is they come to you, and perhaps they did not call you back last night and they slept off, right? So the next day morning you're like, whatever he says, you're like, So that's kind of passive. You're not actually shouting or howling or screaming or actually calling out on the person. At the same time, you're a bit aggressive. You're not very friendly or you're not your usual way. That's one sort of passive aggressive behavior. Similar one can be if there is a fight in uh, at home, husband wife. So what happens is the wife cooks the meal but adds a lot of chili. That's also a passive aggressive behavior. Similarly, a lot of neurotic defense mechanisms. It's controlling, displacement, inhibition, externalization, intellectualization, rationalization, reaction formation, repression, sexualization, undoing, inhibition, right? So I'll not talk about most of it, but I'll give some examples in the next slide. And the mature defense mechanisms are something which is important, and I'll talk about each of it. So asceticism is where you deny all pleasures, and that is usually what the rishis and munis do. Just say कि मुझे नहीं चाहिए. I don't want the worldly pleasures. They denounce all the worldly pleasures. That is one of the defense mechanisms which is considered as mature. Next is suppression. So there is another thing called repression in the neurotic mechanisms, where what you do is uh, I saw a patient who presented with blindness, right? And what happened is, she was evaluated extensively. There was no eye lesion, no brain lesion, no stroke, nothing. And then what happened is, so she was admitted with us, and we did a form of deeper analysis. And then we got to know the reason was she has been blind since the day uh, her ex boyfriend got engaged. And what happened is she saw the picture. And when she saw the picture, she said to herself, I wish I had never seen this picture, or I wish I was blind before I saw this picture. And that is when she fainted, and when she woke up, she was blind. So, this is what is depression, when that complete memory of a distressing conflict actually goes to your unconscious and you're not aware about it anymore. That is how the defense mechanism protects your ego, and it results in one of the symptoms or the other. So that is depression, when one particular conflict is completely erased from your memory, right? It's like a dissociative amnesia about the event, and then that is how you feel relief. So what happens in suppression is you are trying to suppress it. That is, you're actually trying to postpone attention to that particular topic. What example we can give is, for example, I have an exam coming up tomorrow, and maybe I just had big conflict in the family. They just want me to come back and maybe sort out the conflict in the family. That's completely not related to me. So what I decide to do is I decide to give my exams tomorrow and then go and sort out the conflict. So what I do in suppression is I postpone giving attention to that particular problem, and that is something I do consciously or voluntarily. So which does not happen in neurotic defenses. That happens in the unconscious. Automatically it happens. Altruism is where you try to you try to do good to others. That is what is altruism. For example, um, a lot of us actually do a lot of altruism where we give away things to other people who need it more than us. Maybe even giving beggars the alms that we give. That is also a form of altruism. And donation is also a form of altruism. I work at the KIT University. They have something called the art of giving, which is also one of the forms of altruism. Next is sublimation. So sublimation is, for example, you try to channelize your emotions into a healthy way. Um, I'll give you an example. For example, there's a breakup between a husband and a wife, between a couple, a boyfriend girlfriend. So there are different ways to cope with it, right? Some people go just like मुझे I'm not feeling good, मुझे अच्छा नहीं लग रहा है, जाके I think I should drink, ठीक है? So you thought you should drink and you started drinking. That is acting out, right? Then you thought कि मुझे बहुत गुस्सा आ रहा है, मैं जाके उसका घर तबाह कर दूंगा. I'll just create a scene and come out. So that is also acting out. Suppose after that, what happens is you decide I have a lot of anger, right? So what I'll do is मैं कुछ बन के दिखाऊंगा, ठीक है? And you channelize your anger into studies and or maybe into a sport or maybe something that you want to do or you're passionate about, and you actually become more successful than the person. There are a lot of movies these days are throwing this kind of concepts where after a breakup, the other person goes on to become an IS officer, an IPS officer, and stuff like that, right? So that is sublimation, where you channelize your difficult emotions into something which is productive and constructive and actually contributes to your growth. That is sublimation. The next is humor. Humor is when you try to make a joke or try to crack a humor out of the situation, which is only witty people can do it. It's not very easy to do. And the next is anticipation. Anticipation is, for example, I have an exam tomorrow, right? So suddenly panicking right now does not make sense. So if I anticipate, or maybe when the exam dates are out, I start anticipating that the exams, this particular subject is going to be difficult, and I try to plan my time strategy accordingly, depending on which subject needs to be given more importance. That is how I anticipate and plan. That is called anticipation, which is also one of the mature defense mechanisms, right? So yes, These are a few figures I thought might be interesting. So displacement is when your boss shouts at you at work, right? And you come and shout at your wife without any reason. That's displacement. You displace the anger or the conflict from somewhere else on people that are known to you. That's displacement. And after this, the cycle can continue. The mother can go and shout at the child, and the child can go and shout at the dog at the house, right? So that is how the displacement cycle continues. The next is depression, where suppose there is a conflict between this guy and the girl, and what he does is tries to build a brick in between it as if she does not exist, right? So that's depression. So what sublimation is? Suppose there is a conflict, and this guy goes and starts punching the bag and becomes a wrestler. That's sublimation. Regression is, I said, you just sit and start crying about it, so behave like a child. So that's one of the defense mechanisms of regression. Uh, what we do in rationalization is, I'll give you an example in the next slide, so I'll skip for now. Denial is it did not happen. Displacement, I told you. Projection is, like I said, blaming someone else. Yes, so these are two interesting slides I also found. So suppose you had a drink last night, not a drink, you had really a lot of drinks last night, and the next day morning you are in a hangover state. And if you start saying I'm not having a hangover, so that's denial, right? So the projection is when you say the other person, you are in a hangover state, I'm not me. So that's projection, right? And then it's displacement. Whoever comes to you starts scolding that person because you're feeling bad about yourself. So that's you suck, you start scolding, that's displacement. And then suppose you are in a hangover state and you start saying yourself, oh, this is awesome. So that's reaction formation, which is exactly the opposite of what you're feeling, and you try to do it more. So that's reaction formation, right? This is a very interesting example of rationalization when you actually hit someone uh, with a hammer to the extent that the person is going to die, and then you say, there was a fly on your head, that is why I did it. So that's rationalization. We do it for a lot of times for prank or maybe playing with the friends. But if you're actually doing it in your life for some reason or the other, that could be a defense, immature defense mechanism that's happening. Okay. Okay. So before, so that comes to the end of what Freud had to say about ego defenses, the conscious, unconscious, preconscious state, right? And then there is this beautiful lady. Uh, and if anyone can say, I'm not very sure if there are any people out there. So yes, so we have some people. So can you just tell me who this lady is? There's a picture there. Who this lady is? If you can type in the chat box, if anyone has any idea. If you can just say no, I don't know. That's also fine. Okay, so maybe so she is Melanie Klein, and she was maybe abandoned by her parents, and she grew up in a foster home, and that is where she started maybe doing a deeper analysis into what could be the reason about the impact that could have happened on her because of the early childhood deprivation and the kind of relationship she had in the uh, early part of her life. So she gave the concept of object relations theory. So what happens here? It says we as people, we exist in terms of objects or the kind of feelings we have for objects. So it says there are three phases of it. The autistic phase is the initial 0 to 1 month of life, where the child is just existing in his or her own um, I would say own world, where the child just wakes up, has food, and goes back. So that's the autistic phase, which is initially the first month of life. Then the symbiotic phase, where you exist with your mother as a symbiosis. Like you start interacting with the mother, but primarily it is more of, um, I would say, you're a part of the mother, you're almost there with the mother. It's like a symbiosis. And then the last is the separation individuation phase, where you, although physically are a separate person, but you only start separating after the age of around 8 months or 9 months. That you start exploring the world, you start walking, you start doing things on your own, and the individuality starts coming in. What it says, how we view ourselves uh, is, for example, I view myself as someone who's lovable, competent, worthless, or powerless, and how I define myself depends on a lot of things and the way I'm treated. uh, there is another way how I view me. how I view others. Others are either trustworthy, they're reliable, they're dangerous, or manipulative. And based on this, about what view I hold about myself or others, there's a relationship that exists between me and anyone on the outside, right? And this is how the relationship happens. For example, if I view myself as someone who is lovable, competent, so maybe I'll get someone who will, because of which I feel like that. And if I view someone as not trustworthy or dangerous, obviously I'll not be um, very proactive in maintaining the relationships. And how all of this happens is what is explained by the object relations theory. I'll try to be very simple in terms of trying to explain you what exactly it is. So it says we tend to be the most comfortable in relationships that resemble the ones that we were raised in, even if it may be toxic. For example, you had a very gentle, patient, and loving parents, right? So the child feels, yes, I'm lovable, right? And the child perceives people around him to be caring and trustworthy. That is how, if you grow up in a loving environment, you feel so, right? But for example, if your parents were unpredictable, suppose they kept having fights in between them, or they were always cranky, they were shouting, howling around you, so you start believing perhaps, and you start crying, right? So they are not in a state to respond to your cry. So you start believing that perhaps I'm unlovable, and maybe people around me are going to be unreliable. They might turn violent at any point of time. They're unpredictable, so I do not know what to do with the world. And based on this, you form a relationship in the future. Where, for example, if you had a father who was abusive, then you tend to also turn to abusive father because you perceive the world to be like that, and you do not have any other way of relating. Similarly, this is an example where suppose there is a child who is crying, and at the same time the father suppose is drinking and is abusive towards the wife. So when the child starts crying and the mother is there, she perhaps feels numb and she's not able to respond and she leaves. The child starts feeling I'm unlovable. My mom will abandon me if I express my needs, and other people are either fragile like my mother or violent like my father. That is the schema that goes in the child, right? And similarly, the child grows up to be a bit more maybe mature, and he can predict when the father is going to be violent. So he starts behaving utterly silent. He retorts to its own room when the father starts drinking, and is more caring towards the mother and tries to make the mother more happy. So this child learns, I must not let my needs known. I must be compliant in relationships and I should take care of people at all costs. That is the schema that the child develops in. So when this child grows up to have a relationship with a girlfriend or someone, so he's the first to apologize always. He'll say, I'm sorry, you're right, I'm sorry. Just to avoid the conflict because it's fearful. When the partner starts crying, this person will be like, "What do you need, and what can I do for you?" and goes to any extent to fulfill the needs of the other person. And if at all they enter into a healthy relationship on the right side, for example, there is no toxicity, there is no drama, then they tend to feel bored about it. I'm bored. I think I'm bored with her. There's nothing interesting because perhaps the healthy relationship is something that they were never exposed to. And always in the mind, they had to have that toxicity or drama going on to be safe, right? And if the other person is caring and they express love and they start giving gifts, so she starts feeling she's smothering me. I don't have my freedom. I don't know why she's doing all of this. You do not know how to reciprocate when you actually shard love. So this is how the object relations theory explains why a child who was a victim of violence becomes abusive towards his or her own children. Right? So that is very brief about the object relations theory. Next, I'll come to this gentleman, and if anyone can name it, fine. Otherwise, I'll go on. So he's Dr. John Bowlby, right? And he gave the concept of attachment theory. So what attachment theory talks about is it's like, for example, there's a child and the mother, and the mother child bond is supposed to be the basis of the attachment that we talk about in all relationships. And that attachment lays a framework into how we develop as a person or our personality develops. For example, um, if your attachment is secure, right? For example, you had a parent who was always available to fulfill your needs. Uh, then you start feeling safe, you start feeling secure, you're not very avoidant, you have very low anxiety, and that's a form of the attachment which is secure attachment, right? That is the healthiest form of attachment that a person can develop. But for example, you had a mother who was in depression all the time, right? So what happens is the depressive mother will be always, maybe either overcaring or maybe detached. So if the mother was depressed and the mother was distant, right? Or if the child grew up in an environment, like for example, the parents abandoned the child and they grew up in foster homes or childcare institutions or orphanages, so perhaps they never had a supportive figure to relate to, right? And that is when they tend to become a bit avoidant and dismissive, right? So that is low anxiety and high avoidance, the left bottom. And suppose you had an environment where the mother was always anxious, right? Always preoccupied. Kuch ho jayega, kuch ho jayega, kuch ho jayega. So here what happens, the avoidance is low, but it is high on anxiety because you always start expecting something is going to happen, right? That is anxious and preoccupied. And the last is suppose you had a mother who was psychotic or you had a very violent environment in which you grew up. So you tend to have high avoidance and high anxiety. And that's when we say it's called the disorganized form of attachment, right? So what happens is when a person with a secure attachment style grows up, they become confident, they have preserved self-worth, and they accept support, right? If you're anxious, you tend to be clingy, highly emotional, and always have the need to seek reassurance, right? If you become avoidant, you're like distant, a bit unemotional, you avoid closeness, right? And if it is disorganized, it's like very intense. You keep pushing, pulling, and it's very unpredictable, right? So this is how the attachment theory evolved, and it helps in understanding how particular personality patterns develop if detachment in the early stages of life uh, have been deranged, right? So these are the three core fundamental principles based on which we perform therapy, which is the psychoanalytic or the psychodynamic forms of therapy. And the psychodynamic therapy is perhaps the earliest form of therapies that started happening. It dates back to Freud, who was the father. And it says the primary thing about therapy is to deal with the unconscious. What happened first is the unconscious. A lot of our awareness is like in the unconscious state. Whatever we do is because of the unconscious state. So that is what the psychodynamic theory says. It says it's based very much in the past experiences, and they say that the past experience shape the present. That is the developmental perspective. It has a subjectivity, like it says your experience is very much personal to you. So you have a personal meaning of events, and that is what should be the focus. It talks about this concept of transference. Transference as in, for example, as I said, I have a particular schema of relationships in my mind, right? So when I come to therapy, so I will try and see the therapist as one or other of my past relationships. It could be a father, it could be a mother, it could be a friend, it could be a romantic partner, it could be anyone. So that kind of a relationship plays out in therapy, and that what we experience towards the therapist or the patient experience towards the therapist is called transference. Then it is resistance when they have ambivalence about change, and the last is it says all behavior has a psychological cause. Right? So that is the core tenets of psychodynamic therapy. What are the techniques that we use in this therapy? First is clarification, where you tend to ask open-ended questions. Can you tell me more about that? What do you mean by depressed? Not just deriving meaning out of whatever the person is saying, but helping them elaborate on what they mean by whatever term they use. So that's the goal, is to understand patient's perspective. The second is confrontation, where you start saying wherever there are contradictions. Like for example, I notice you say you're fine, but you're crying. Right? So when you put that on face, on table, maybe the person will be able to talk more about it, and that is when you understand why is the person crying and still saying I'm fine. Does the person have difficulty in accepting that yes, I'm crying, I'm not feeling well, and maybe has been shut down in the past, forced to be said, "You're okay, you're doing fine, you don't have to be crying, a crying baby." So that kind of a confrontation can actually help the person gain insight into what's happening, right? And then the interpretation, that perhaps your anger at me reflects feelings towards your father, right? And that is the unconscious meaning. And once you provide this interpretation, the psychodynamic or the psychoanalytic theory says bringing the unconscious to conscious will possibly help you cure whatever suffering you have. That is the basis. And then I talked about the transference and countertransference. So transference is how the patient unconsciously relates to the therapist as from someone in the past. For example, if the patient starts not trusting the therapist, no, I don't trust you. I don't know if you will go and talk outside to you will talk to my enemies. I don't know. So that may reflect early caregiver relationship. So whatever happens, you can actually try and understand why it is happening. And countertransference is when the therapists start having emotional reactions to it. For example, you have an appointment, the patient has an appointment maybe tomorrow, and the patient does not come for an appointment. And you have reserved a particular slot for that patient. You come, you wait for the entire time, and then the patient does not turn up, and you make a call, and they don't receive your call, right? So what happens? You start experiencing anger. So this is how perhaps the patient has been behaving in his or her daily life, and they maybe make appointments or they make commitments and they don't turn up. And that is how people around him have been hostile towards him and have anger towards him. And this is a very valuable diagnostic tool if you're aware about what are the experiences that you're having with him. And that is a window to the patient's internal world because the patient might be experiencing a lot of these experiences where he has people like you feeling the same in and around him all the time, right? So you usually you feel unusually irritated in a passive client. You know, whatever you ask him, when do you want to come the next time? And they'll say, whatever you say, doctor. And that might reveal the client's pattern of evoking frustration in relationships. They'll not take a decision. They'll be very passive, and you tend to get frustrated, right? So perhaps people around him have been feeling the same. So when we talk about technical neutrality, it's another concept. It's like, for example, a patient is crying in front of you, okay, or the patient is very upset and very angry. So if you're not a therapist or you're not trained in psychotherapy, so what you tend to do as a human being is, you just go and comfort the person, right? So maybe give a pat or actually hug the person or provide a tissue or something like that. So all of that is also something called as how people would react in a situation. But we as therapists, we are not supposed to do anything like that. Okay, so we need to be neutral. Even if the patient is crying, you need to be neutral. Even if the patient is angry and upset, you need to be neutral. So that does not mean you have to be a blank screen, you have to be stone faced, you have to be cold and uncaring, or you have to be silent and passive, or you refuse to be a human. That is not what I'm talking about. But it's actually a non judgmental stance. It has to be a warm and genuine, equidistant from all parts of the conflict, and create safety for exploration. For example, there's a couple who is there and they keep fighting among the two, saying this is right, this is wrong, and a lot of that. So what you are there is not to take the stance of one particular person saying this is right or wrong. You just try to be equidistant from both the people. At the same time, be genuine and be reflective of whatever you say. I'll give an example. For example, there's this couple who keeps saying, the husband says a wife cannot go to work. Maybe after 10 p.m. she is not supposed to be outside. She has to come in. And this lady is actually working in an MCA, which is like a US-based company. So she has to work till maybe 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock at night, right? And this is the conflict which has been ongoing, and particularly the conflicts has been surrounding the timings because they expect the woman to be available in the family as well. So, what you can say here, you're not the one who is supposed to say right and wrong. That is not what they are here for. They're here to seek help for resolving the conflict and to have an understanding where both of the parties feel loved, valued, and cared for, and their conflict is addressed, right? So that is what it means. How to do it is actually a very long and very tiring to understand, but maybe this is one example which can help maybe a bit more understanding about psychodynamic therapy. So suppose there is a client who is a 28-year-old male and they present to you with some anxiety around relationships, right? So the pattern is when women tend to get close to him, he tends to pull away, right? And if you try to explore the history, you see that the mother was very intrusive and the father was emotionally absent. So what happens maybe he comes to you maybe for 3 4 sessions and a session in which he revealed that the mother was intrusive, father was absent. Just after that, the next session he cancels it until he does not turn up, maybe for 2 or 3 sessions. So, what is the psychodynamic understanding? The defense mechanism that he's using is avoidance because he's not turning up. The object relationship is maybe he feels that if you are intimate to someone, they will engulf you completely, right? Like the way the mother was in Joseph. The transference is he could perceive the therapist as an intrusive mother because he actually disclosed something which was very close to his heart. He might feel vulnerable and he might feel that the therapist will engulf him or something like that. And the attachment style that we see here is avoided, right? So, how do we intervene? We clarify that help me understand what it was like to share the very sensitive information that you shared. Right? Then you can the techniques I said. No, first is clarify. The second is confront. You opened up and then cancelled. What happened? Right? And then interpret. Perhaps closeness feels dangerous. What do you feel about it? And then link the past with the present and with the current transference. And that itself can be therapeutic for a lot of people. So takeaways from this part of the talk is unconscious powerfully influences behavior. That is the tenet of psychodynamic psychotherapy. Defense mechanisms are normal. So what we need to do is we need to understand and not necessarily pathologize every defense mechanism that we have. Our past relationships do shape our current patterns, and the theories I just enumerated. Transference and countertransference are clinical gold, and that is the only thing that is going to give you some clue about what you want to do next. And then the technique that we need to use is clarify, confront, and interpret. Right. So that brings me to the end of the first chapter. Right. So if there are any doubts, I can take it up now, or maybe you can leave it in the chat box, and I'll take it a little later. Okay. So I guess there are no questions. So I'll start talking about the next chapter. Okay. So this is the second part, which is inside psychotherapy and interpersonal therapy. Um, so what I wish to cover in this part of it is the first part that I covered about was focusing on psychoanalytic and psychodynamic therapy. And I did not talk about the limitations of that form of therapy. The first is it takes years for a person to actually find a meaningful change and to even explore what is the underlying psychopathology that is ongoing. Because for transference to establish it also takes time, at least 8 to 4 sessions. So people started coming up with the criticism, like you start saying all of it is in the past and everything that happened in the past shapes me today. Can I not do anything about it today? Is there anything that happens here and now? And is there anything that you can help me with now? So then people started coming up with different forms of therapy, and two of the important therapies are insight-based therapy and interpersonal therapy. So insight-based therapy is usually the psychoanalysis, analytical, existential, person-centered, and gestalt therapy. So these are very different, and each of these therapies is I would say has very core principles which are very different from the other. Obviously, I'll not be able to complete each of it in detail. So, what I'll be talking about is primarily the core principles based on which all of these therapies happen. So, then I'll be moving into the interpersonal therapy applications, and then maybe have one or two scenarios where maybe we can see what we can do. Right. So, what is insight psychotherapy? So, insight psychotherapy is the core assumption here is behavior, thoughts, and emotions become distorted because individuals don't understand what motivates them, especially when there is a conflict between needs and drives. Right? And the fundamental goal is once we are aware about what is happening within, you can actually control what is happening, and that is how you will improve your emotion, thought, and behavior. Right? So, the it principle that we talked about, the structural model, it ego, super ego. So, how do we assess what is happening? What is happening in your head? What is happening in your ego? What is happening in your super ego? So, all of that analysis I briefly talked to you about before. The technique that I talked to you about was explore, then confront, and then interpret. So, how to do that and what to explore? There are different ways to do it. The first is the free association, where we just allow the person to sit on a couch. All of you must be familiar with that picture where a client is allowed to sleep on a couch and then they asked to talk and keep talking and talking and talking, and that is uncensored. And then maybe whenever they talk, There might be some slips or something which we call as Freudian slip, and they're trying to interpret why did this happen. Like for example, a lot of time we might be wanting to say something, but we say something else. And why does that happen? That also is one of the grounds of deeper analysis. Then there is something called the dream analysis, where we have a strong belief that dreams are the gateway to unconscious state. And dream analysis itself has a lot of steps: dream formation, then interpreting, analyzing, breaking it up. There are some general principles based on which we also analyze dreams. Um, but yes, it's not evidence based because we do not have a lot of literature supporting dream analysis, and that is why all of the psychoanalysis techniques have fallen out of repute. Then we have transference, which I talked about in detail, and difference analysis, right? Then came the era of Carl Jung, who said the concept of analytical psychology, and he gave there are two states of unconsciousness. One is the personal unconscious, like for example, my conflicts, my unresolved issues, and the complexes that I have within, right? And then there is a collective unconscious, that is universal images, universal instincts, which all of us have, and there are archetypes based on it. Right. So he said what is unconscious can be specific to a particular person or can be not specific but generic for all of the same species. For example, there was something that Freud said about the Oedipus complex, Electra Oedipus complex. So that is about the development of female and a male gender in terms of the sexual feelings a child has towards the opposite gender parent. Like for example, they say perhaps the female child has an anxiety that because they do not have the male genitalia, they feel perhaps if they do not have it, they feel inferior or they feel anxious about it, and a person who has it feels that perhaps people will cut it away from me. So that's called the castration anxiety. And then there is this Oedipus complex where a female child feels attracted to the a male parent or the father, and a male child is getting attracted to the female. So a lot of unconscious things like that happen, which was also pointed out by Freud. But the primary criticism that Freud received was there was a lot of psychosexual and a lot of emphasis based only on eros and sexuality and not necessarily acknowledging the cognitive aspect of a person. And we as human beings have a very big prefrontal cortex, and we have a very strong I would say problem solving, executive functioning, cognitive functioning, and that was completely overlooked. And that is why all of these subsequent psychologists came and they gave the other concepts, right? So if you people are willing to participate, which I would definitely appreciate, can you just tell me what kind of therapy will you choose in this particular scenario? A 35-year-old client presents a recurrent relationship pattern where they repeatedly choose emotionally unavailable partners. They report childhood experiences of an absent father and seeking approval. They are motivated and articulate but struggle to understand why they continue the pattern despite awareness, right? So, what would you want to do here? Would you want to do psychoanalysis and explore transference and unconscious conflicts? Would you want a person centered therapy where you create a safe space for discovery? Or would you create something like a gestalt or empty chair technique with an absent father? What are the techniques that you want to achieve? Will anyone be willing to say something? Maybe A, B, or C, you can just type in the chat box, whatever technique. Now I want to hear some responses. It's been almost an hour. I've been talking constantly. So no response does not give a good motivation to continue, right? So I want a response either A, B, and C to continue further. At least one or two responses. Okay. Thank you, Sushmita, for responding. So you would like to explore transference and unconscious conflicts, right? So you want to do further psychoanalysis. Okay. But this particular person also has this problem. Ki, I am aware that this is the problem. So why would you want to analyze it further? Any particular thing in your mind, if you can type down? I'll say you're right, actually, because just being aware that I had an absent father and I'm seeking approval does not necessarily complete the analysis, right? So yes, Tripti, you have something to say, or it's for tenants? I think it's for tenants. Okay. So yes. So yeah, there could be some other unconscious conflicts that could be ongoing. So yes, very good. But I would say each of the therapies that have been listed here do have a very important space in this particular form of patients, because in psychoanalysis you have a different goal where you try to address further unconscious conflicts. But the second concept, that is person centered, is like when once you're aware about your conflict and all, you can actually ask this question, so what's stopping you from healing? Sometimes, I'll be talking about this concept of, I already finished talking about it, the object relations theory, where you try to replicate the same pattern that you have been used to. And it's very difficult to move beyond what you're already comfortable in. Even if it's misery, you would choose that repeatedly rather than the uncertainty of not knowing what's going to happen, right? And the empty chair technique with absent father also helps you heal from a trauma like this, where you had to spend an entire childhood with an absent father, right? So this particular exercise was to help you understand no matter whatever form of therapy you wish to apply, you can actually do it, but the goals of it will be different, the time frame of it will be different. But yes, if you want to study further unconscious conflicts, you can continue with psychoanalysis. But I would prefer personally a person-centered therapy here, because once you're aware, maybe it needs you to have a safe space for guided discovery as well. The next form of therapy, because I had this question, so I put it in before. So it says humanistic approaches, where most of the belief systems say that you are complete in yourself. What the psychoanalysis says is there's definitely a problem in your past, right? And it has to do a lot with how your relationships in the early childhood have been there, which has been bad. There has been a problem with you, your relationship with your parents, your parenting techniques. So there has been a problem in the past, okay, and that is why you're suffering. So that's like a critical version of psychoanalysis, what it wants to say, and that is the assumption based on which all the analytic procedures happen. What humanistic approach says is like, yes, problems are there, that's fine, but you have a personal responsibility to get better, and you have the ability to get better. And that is what humanistic approaches are. So that is why it is the existential therapy, where you focus on existence. You take the personal responsibility of your existence. You become aware that yes, these are problems which are there. Possibly they're right now there, they may not be there in the long term, and I can achieve my full potential. So that is existential therapy, where they focus on existence and everything else is considered as a part and parcel of existence, and the existence is most important, and you have the potential to go beyond it. The one form of therapy here also is person centered therapy, where the core theme is you provide unconditional positive regard. You have a lot of empathy towards yourself. So it's non-directive. You do not say do this, do that. The client finds its own solution. You're just here to guide the way, and it's genuine, right? Here you focus on the congruence in helping the person achieve what they want to do, irrespective of or despite how much they have made mistakes, right? And then this is gestalt therapy, which is like the famous empty chair technique. And it focuses on here and now, the wholeness of a personality, and awareness is curative, right? So it says basically people are good. Okay? And even if I have a lot of bad qualities, inside genuinely I'm good. Innate goodness should be allowed to show. Focus on present moment in the therapy room. Discourage why questions, right? Avoid escape to the past. We are not here to say why. We are here to ask what is happening, what. And the famous technique is empty chair technique. Like the previous example, suppose you have an absent father in your early childhood, in that form of a relationship. So what happens is, if you had your father sitting right next to you in this chair, what would you want to say? What is the question that you want to ask? Is there anything that you want to advise him or tell him, right? So once you leave that and you allow the person to vent out, that brings a lot into their awareness about what exactly they have missed and how they want to work on it. So that's one of the famous techniques. The next part of it is behavior therapies. So behavior therapy itself it came as a revolution in psychotherapy. So I'll tell you about what happened in psychotherapy. There are four waves of psychotherapy. The first wave was the psychoanalytic, psychodynamic, and the existential therapies that I talked about earlier. And that was a lot based on your past, like why it happened, more of why kind of questions. So then there were a lot of behavior therapists who came up, starting with experiments from B.F. Skinner, who started saying, yes, it's possible, it might be true, but what's evidence for it? Can you show it to me this is working? Can you show it to me once you bring to evidence this person is actually better? So what maximum evidence was available was case-based reports, and no two cases were similar. So to generalize one principle from one to another was actually very difficult, and to justify evidence was difficult. So in a world of rapidly progressing scientific advancements, psychotherapy failed off repute, right? So behavior therapy started coming back because it started to give back results. It was replicable, right? And it started talking about the theories of learning. All of us are aware about the operant conditioning and learning theories, right? So based on that, this particular therapy said a lot of the problematic behavior is a product of learning. So once something is learned, it can be unlearned as well, right? And if the problematic behavior ceases the reward that it's supposed to get, it can be extinguished over time. So there are a lot of forms of therapy about it. One is systematic desensitization, aversion therapy, social skill training. There are reinforcement therapy, differential reinforcement, positive reinforcement. So there's a lot there. So I'll not go into the details of it because perhaps that is not what your syllabus talks about it extensively. But behavior therapies, I think the principles and the theories of learning is something that is important for you to understand, right? Then that there's insight-based therapies. What is the relevance of all of it today? So there was an Eisen took a challenge in 1952, and it said no evidence that insight therapies helped. Okay? And there was a spontaneous remission rate that two-thirds of people improved without treatment. Right? But however, subsequently a lot of research happened with control studies, and it started saying insight-based therapies were actually durable. It had effect which was superior to at least placebo, and there was a clinical benefit, right? So right now the perspective is if you have the time and the expertise and the client is motivated, insight therapies do help. But the most important thing is the expertise of the therapist, right? And this is the second part of this second chapter is the interpersonal therapy. It was developed by Klugman and Wisman. It was primarily started with the treatment of non-psychotic depression. I'll tell you what is the basis of it. So it's like person's mood and my interpersonal world are interdependent. For example, right now if I'm feeling happy, I'll go and talk to people, everyone around me, my friends, my relatives, my parents, my children, and all of that. I'll start talking to them very happily, and they'll be all very happy about it, right? They'll be like, wow, that so and so person is so good, they're always friendly, they're always caring, they're always available, they're always fun, they're always around, right? So your mood and your interpersonal world, if you're happy, is like this. For example, you're sad and you're cranky today, or irritable. Right? So what do you do? Anyone comes to your house, what do? You go back to your room. Someone comes and talks to you, what do you say? Let me alone, I'm not feeling good. Okay, they call you for lunch, they call you for dinner, they call you to go outside, what do you say? I'm not interested. Right? And then they start perceiving you as very unfriendly, like unsocial, not willing to do anything, blah, 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 blah. So once your mood is on the bad side, the entire world around you, the interpersonal world, completely becomes different, right? That is the principle based on which the interpersonal psychotherapy works. Okay? It says interpersonal events lead to depressive symptoms. For example, if I had a fight with my friend, I tend to be depressed. And once I'm depressed, what do? I tend to react differently, right? So there's a vicious cycle that keeps happening, and that is why the treatment goal is if you improve the functioning, your mood improves. For example, uh, what do we do here? So it's usually time limited. There are 12 to 15 sessions weekly, 50, 45 to 50 minutes each. It's very focused. We focus on one or two key interpersonal issues, and it's here and now. So current functioning. We do not focus on what happened in the past and all of that. We focus on what happens now. What are you feeling? Okay. And what we suggest is what we can do right now. So there are four problem areas where usually we tend to do interpersonal therapy. The first is grief, which is complicated bereavement. That is why we use it. The second is when there are role disputes or interpersonal conflicts. That's particularly when the role transitions, for example, there is a marriage that is happening. For example, you suddenly become a parent one fine day, and or maybe you lose a spouse or lose a child, and then there are role transitions that happen suddenly, right? And then it could be interpersonal deficits when you tend to be socially isolated, particularly in the elderly age group or because of other reasons, you tend to have social isolation. These are the areas where interpersonal therapy usually works, right? So what are the techniques here? The first is exploratory technique where we are directive and non-directive. Both we have to use, right? Clarify. Um, for example, paraphrasing is a very important term in therapy. I'll just help you understand what does that mean. Suppose there's a couple out there sitting in front of you, right? And then the husband says, "I get very upset uh, when uh, uh, when I come home and she's still cooking," right? For example. So what you can help and clarify here is maybe you can paraphrase. When you come back from work and it's usually late, you're hungry. So do you expect the meal to be ready by then? So can you just make a call just before coming so that your wife knows that you'll be there in 30 minutes or so and she can be more prepared accordingly. So something like that where you can actually clarify and get back to the person. It's not your wife's problem, but maybe a problem in your communication style where you're not actually informing when you're able to come and she does not have a clear expectation, right? So that is where is the problem. So how do we get there and how do we encourage affect? Like for example, if you are angry, you can say this is why I'm angry. If you can talk about communication patterns, maybe or like maybe give a directive strategy also. Why not make a call the moment you start from office, and maybe have a role play about different communication patterns. About you can give them a script about this is what you have to say to your wife before you start any conversation, or maybe once you enter the room, do this. Maybe you can have a ritual about it. You can maybe your wife can come up to you, receive you. You can have a hug or something. She can carry the bottle with her, or you want a water, something. Some ritual around how the moment that he comes home is actually very beautiful, and maybe then they can talk about problems later. Maybe after maybe 30 minutes or so, after he winds down, after he has time to relax and feel a little better about himself, right? So that is what interpersonal therapy does. It focuses on improving the relationships or the interpersonal communication styles based on which your models are getting improved, right? Okay, so this is a scenario. It's a 42-year-old woman recently divorced after 15 years of marriage. The problem currently is she has clinical moderate depression. There's social withdrawal, difficulty adjusting to living alone. There's conflict with adult children who blame her for the divorce. There has been no prior episodes of depression and she was actually functioning well before it. So can you tell me which IPT problem area will you want to focus on? What are the specific techniques that you think would be most helpful? And how would you structure the first three sessions? If you can just talk about the first question, maybe I'll answer the other two for you. You can type it in the chat box. Any response? Any particular areas, IPT problem areas you would want to focus on? Anyone wants to answer? I'll wait for your response. At least some response I want. I just cannot keep continuing like this for 2 hours. No response? Any two problem areas? I think, acha, there has been some answer written below also. Maybe you can type that as well. Hmm. So this time Sushmita is also not responding, right? You don't know the answer. Okay, okay then. At least saying we do not know also helps, right? So what IPT problem I would focus on in this case is I can see there is a very clear mention of a divorce after 15 years of marriage, right? So there's a significant role transition. And we also talked about living arrangements where she is forced to stay alone. She has a difficulty adjusting to it, right? Maybe these are the two areas. One is living alone, which is a role transition, and the second is conflict with adult children, and their adults, right? That is also something that I would like to focus on. But I would like to start with the first part of it, that is the role transition and handling the divorce. Okay. And how I would like to structure the initial sessions is maybe I can start with the first session exploring her current living status, exploring her feelings about the same. Was it a planned or an unplanned marriage? And then unplanned marriage, as in, was it a divorce from her side, the husband side? Why and how is she affected? What are the expectations that are shattered? And maybe if I start with all of that, then we can start with what does she want and how, if things are different, she would be able to cope. And maybe start by making one small change every single day of focusing 5 minutes at a time, a 5 minute brief interaction with one of the adult child, or maybe 5 minute brief interaction with her own self. Because if she is living alone, maybe she needs to have a lot of interpersonal therapy related to how she can be at peace with her own self as well. So that is what I'll be talking about. But what is the resistance in interpersonal therapy? Usually people start coming late, miss appointments, remain silent, discuss irrelevant material, avoid painful topics. And resistance sometimes is a role dispute where the patient and therapist expectations are not matching. Okay? So maybe you can actually discuss the behavior openly and help the client to talk more about it. Okay? So I'll just compare these two therapies. One is insight-based therapies, one is interpersonal therapy. Insight-based therapies, as I talked about, is like for months to years. IPT is like usually time-based, 20, 12 to 15, 16 sessions, max 20 sessions. In insight therapies, we focus on the unconscious and the past. IPT, we focus on current functioning. In insight-based therapy, the goal is for self-awareness and personality change. In IPT, it is more of to improve the mood and current relationships. So insight therapies are best for pattern recognition, for motivated clients who are willing to engage in that form of therapy. And IPT is primarily for depression with interpersonal issues with significant role transitions. So that is the ideal area where we can do IPT. The key takeaway will be insight-based therapies are better for greater awareness. We have a lot of multiple approaches. It based on client needs and motivation, and research supports evidence of effectiveness when properly applied. However, IPT is time limited. It addresses one or two interpersonal problem areas. It's more of here and now, and it's as effective as antidepressants for depression. So it's very, very effective, particularly for mood disorders. So which therapy I would consider in a particular case depends on what the person wants and based on the above table. Right. So these are a few reading materials, particularly for these two forms of therapy. The one is the textbook of psychotherapeutic treatments by Kapat, Interpersonal Psychotherapy for Depression by Klerman, and The Gift of Therapy by Adam. Right. Okay. So this brings to the end of the second chapter. Right. So I have two more chapters to go. I can take up questions if you have any. Yes.
Ma'am, just I was thinking, as you told earlier, means behavioral therapy. So sometimes few people they maintain double standard. It means it's very difficult. You must be knowing that. Means suppose any client. Actually, mainly I have one clinic. I am doing counseling sessions for the clients. So few clients come to my clinic and they maintain double standard. It means in front of me they are saying something, but when they go to other places or in the family, usually it happens, but with many people. But how could we means behavioral therapy during giving time? So how we could maintain, and what are the processes so that we have to keep in mind?
Okay. So first of all, I thank you, Mr. Sukanta, for that question. Um, what I would want you to understand here is when you're telling that your client is actually not honest with you, right? They're saying something, but at home something else is happening. So actually, if you have the information that this is happening, maybe you can be more honest with him first, because that is the first step. You can be more honest about where the information is coming from. Or maybe in such scenario, just talking about behavior therapy would not be helpful, because firstly, the client is not completely honest. So in such situations, if the context in which the behavior problem is manifesting is usually within a family, then maybe you can think of something called at least 1 or 2 family sessions, where this problem is actually brought into the session in front of you by the patient himself, and maybe then only you can give a reflection about what is happening. We usually do not recommend trusting other people's information directly or behind the patient's back. But maybe if you want to proceed in therapy, you have to confront this to the patient at some point of the time or the other in a technically appropriate way. What I would do rather here is maybe I see that you're doing well and that is what you're saying. Can I have a session with your wife or maybe your parent or whoever brings the patient? If they're okay about it, fine. If they're not okay about it, you can just talk about it. You know, like, why you're not comfortable? You're saying everything is okay. Is there a problem? Or do you anticipate that they might not say the same thing that you're saying? So those kind of conversations can actually help the patient have a face saving, at the same time a safe space to open up. And behavior-based therapy will work better only if there's complete honesty and transparency about what you feel and what the person sees. If that helped, can you just tell me?
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And this particular problem we face day-to-day scenario, and a lot of people who have personality issues or maybe substance use disorders also, they would not be honest and transparent about it. And that is when we actually want the family to be there in at least a few of the sessions before we proceed with individual sessions as well. Right? So thank you. I think I'll go to the next form of therapy, which is short-term psychotherapies. So I'll not cover each of the short-term psychotherapies in detail, because there are like n number of psychotherapies like that. Okay. But it's very very interesting. So as I can see, there are a few people who are already in practice. So can you tell me what forms of sessions do you usually provide? How many sessions do you usually take? Is it like 1 to 5 sessions for a client, or 6 to 16, or maybe 20 to 30, or maybe more than 30, or it depends on client to client? Can you just tell me like what is your typical number of therapy sessions for people that you see? Any
Ma'am,
number?
actually it depends. Yes, yes, ma'am. Actually, it depends on the client, because many clients they take 1 to 5 sessions, and if it means in a week twice the sessions could be given to them. Sometimes twice in a month. It depends on their basis, but mainly in counseling sessions, it's little like depression, anxiety, stress, or means a behavioral problem. So, ma'am, just I think it maybe 7 to 7 is maximum for many cases. It's not a fixed, but it comes 5 to 7, I think, ma'am.
Okay, so 5 to 7, so less than 10. And I think one more answer in the chat box. Sushmita says A, so it's 1 to 5. So usually in our clientele or our kind of setup, people usually do not tend to stick with therapy for a really long time. So yes, 5 to 10 sessions are the usual duration or the number of sessions that we usually have based on how people turn up, right? So that is what is the most interesting feedback, because all of the therapies that we have talked about so far, particularly the psychoanalytic therapy, psychodynamic therapy, that continues for years, and it's like weekly once or twice. So that results in maybe up to 100 or maybe 200 sessions, right? So that's significantly a lot. And I don't think we have that much patience or the clients have that much time to actually come back to us. That is a typical practice, and that is why we have this topic today, and that is called the brief therapies. Okay? So there has been a paradigm shift in therapy. So people started used to think ki, psychodynamic is always long term, CBT is always short term, and brief therapy are possibly not that effective. The longer it is, the better, and it's only for selected clients. Not everyone can go therapy. But the current reality is brief therapies to exist. There has been long-term CBT which has also been developed. There has been a lot of evidence base up of late for brief therapies as well. It's time efficient and effective and suitable for a vast diverse population, right? And in the last 20 years, because there has been a lot of cost pressure on cost effectiveness, technical innovation, and there has been challenges about the longer is better. And the therapists also recognize this. There is an intrinsic therapeutic value in brief therapies as well, as you rightly mentioned. Most of the clients, they do not they tend to come for 5 to 10 sessions only and not beyond that, right? That is the reality. So that is why when we talk about brief, what is it? It's very relative, right? So there are three types of categories. One is very brief, where it is like 1 to 5 sessions. Duration is usually less than 2 months, and it's usually single session therapy or crisis intervention. For example, there was a exam. Someone failed in the exam. Someone had a very bad exams, and they came to you. They had 2 or 3 sessions, and they went off, right? And then they're doing completely fine, maybe. Or maybe there was a relationship crisis and there was a breakup and then there was a self-harm attempt or something, and they come to you, you have a crisis intervention session or maybe one more session after it, and then they don't turn up, right? So that is the very brief sessions that we talk about. Sessions are usually 1 to 5 and less than 2 months. Then we talk about the brief therapies, which are usually the standard CBT, cognitive behavior therapy or PST or IPT. That is for usually 6 to 16 sessions, and PST is person-specific therapies or person-centric therapies, 2 to 6 months. And then we have time-limited therapies where we have a bit of more time with us, particularly 6 to 9 months. And these restrictions are there on paper, but clinically it may be varying, because sometimes we tend to take more sessions if a client is actually amenable, and sometimes we actually need to prolong sessions if the client is not actually able to understand what we are trying to do. So brief therapy is more than just brief, because it's very intensive. We try to do the same things which we were doing earlier, maybe in 5 sessions. We actually tend to do or club 2 or more sessions into one session. That is what has happened. There's a lot of time limits, and that it based on two philosophies. It facilitates frustration, okay, and it minimizes frustration if you are flexible. Okay. So what we as therapists need to learn here is we have to be more active across all modalities. Like when we are structuring, interpreting, teaching, confronting, collaborating, it does not have to happen like this, after this, after this, after this. And you have to do things as and when needed. That is why there has been a lot of shift from traditional modes of therapy to more of eclectic approaches where you actually combine two or more forms of therapy, right? Like for example, sir was mentioning about the case. You're seeing you have taken up the patient for behavior therapy particularly, but then you say there has been a lot of mismatch and he's not been honest with you. You have to change an approach and you have to be very active about it. There's nothing wrong about you planned something earlier that's not working out. You have to shift to a different mode, and that's completely fine. Okay. So I'll present this another case. It's a 28-year-old teacher. All my examples are 28-year-old. So she's Sarah. So she presented with relationship difficulties. Recently ended a third significant relationship in a similar pattern. She's intelligent, psychologically minded history. She had a critical and emotionally distant mother. And the pattern is she becomes anxious when partners show affection and they pushes them away. She's motivated for a change and not just symptom relief, and currently functioning well at work. So what brief form of therapy would you want to take? Maybe a few answers from you. What form of therapy? Which brief form of therapy would you want to do here? I've talked about, when you choose a form of therapy, you have to take into account the client's situation as well. So here I think she's looking for actually a change and not just symptom relief. So she's looking at a deeper form of therapy, right? So she wants a psychoanalysis, and preferably a brief psychoanalysis, because otherwise she's functioning well. Okay? And there has been significant past issues which are also there. So I would like to maybe consider a brief psychoanalytic approach where I bring it to awareness that this is why she's behaving in a particular way, and then provide her a safe space where she can open up and discuss what are the ways she wants to reframe the way she is dealing with current relationship patterns, right? So, what are the different brief forms of psychodynamic approaches? So, there's three, I would say at least there's three things that all of us need to know. The first is the triangle of insight, which is given by David Milan. So, he says there is a parent usually in the past, their current relationships, right? There's a pattern, where there is an impulse, there's an anxiety, and there's a defense. So, what happened with your parent is actually happening in your current relationships, which you are going to put on the therapist as well. And once I understand what's happening with me, with the therapist and the client, that relationship, I'll be able to help you understand. That's the triangle of insight. And once the client is able to have insight into it, she'll get better, right? The second is the intensive method, which is actually a bit controversial because even if there's a lot of resistance, um, people have described this effort to be a bit more intrusive because once you fight that resistance and gain into it, possibly there's a lot of water of emotions that will actually come into picture. It can actually cause a brief worsening as well. If you have not achieved significant training in this particular method, I would resist caution in exercising it. And the last is essential, existential or time limited, which is exactly 12 sessions. It's non-negotiable termination. And usually what it talks about is at the end of 12 sessions, we have to finish our sessions. Okay? No 13 session. So this time limit is a profound metaphor for life's finiteness. Definitely cannot prolong it forever, right? So simulator sessions cannot be forever, and that is one of the bases of existential James Mind-Best time-limited therapy. I found this a bit interesting, so I thought I'll maybe share a bit more detail about it. So a typical course, what happens is we just provide a link. There could be some link between the current suffering to the past, identify the conflict. But what happens is once you provide the insight, because it's an existential form of therapy, you believe that the person will be able to work on the other problems himself, right? And you reinforce this positive existentialism in the person and then abruptly end it. And that is why we believe that possibly after this, the child or the patient will actually improve because once the person gains insight, he will be able to solve the problem and so on. So that agreement has to happen beforehand, and you have to have a plan about what the person will do but after that, but no meeting you again because that will also improve his self-efficacy. Then we talk about cognitive behavior therapy approaches. I think this is one of the therapies which has the maximum evidence base, particularly for depression, anxiety, OCD, and to some extent also phobias, right? So cognitive behavior therapies usually take 8 to 20 sessions, and here primarily we talk about functional analysis and then having cognitive distortions identification. I think that's not mentioned here. Okay. So there are a lot of active techniques that we actually actively ask the client to keep doing, provide them a feedback. And the Beck's cognitive therapy usually is based on the principles of alternative appraisals. The way I said, there are a lot of cognitive distortions that are happening in your brain, right? In the thought aspect of it, you tend to provide an alternative appraisal through Socratic questioning and give them alternative options. And the last is interpersonal therapy, which I briefly talked to you about earlier, right? Uh, I think what I'll do is I'll talk a bit more about the Beck's cognitive therapy because I think it's important and it's very, very effective for depression, which is one of the most common mental health conditions. So what happens here is depression, there are a lot of cognitive distortions, right? For example, if a person failed in the exam once, the person will say, I'm good for nothing. I'll never be able to do anything in my life, right? I have never been able to achieve anything. Anyways, it does not matter. There is one failure, the child is actually magnifying it to overgeneralization or maybe maximizing it. Okay. So these are two cognitive distortions. So what you do here is you provide an alternative appraisal saying that yes, there is one exam that you failed, but maybe there was a previous exam where you did better. So that is also true. This is also true. It's not that just because you failed one exam, you have never been able to pass. So you try to bring about facts versus the interpretation and the magnification of the distortion and put it across and then tell them this is a healthy way of thinking. And this is an unhealthy or a cognitive distortion which is making you think in a particular way. And this is what we call as a guided discovery. And through Socratic questioning, we actually tend to arrive at why is the person attributing it to it, and then help them replace the negative automatic thoughts or the cognitive distortions with healthy cognitive strategies. Right? This is how the new thinking patterns are going to emerge. Okay. Okay. So next is PST, which is problem solving therapy. It is a very important form of therapy, and it is usually applicable across diagnosis and even for people who do not have a diagnosis, do not have a syndromal diagnosis. It's usually helpful, and it has a 5-stage process. The first is adopt the problem solving orientation. Like the way I said, there is a problem there, and there may be different ways people try to deal with it. If you're using a defense mechanism which is unconscious, you tend to act in different ways. You start to, blame the engine, blame your driver, blame, suppose the car broke down, the example that I gave earlier, right? You blame your driver, you keep blaming the manufacturer, you keep blaming the company of which the car is made, right? And you sit on the road and start crying, take a break and start shouting at your family members, uh, everything goes bad with me, blah, 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 blah. So that is one approach that people usually adopt. The second approach is a problem solving orientation where you see it just as a problem, define the problem, the next step, define the problem, select the goals, create alternative solutions. For example, right now, what are the problems because my car broke down? I need to arrange an alternative mode of transport. So what are the solutions that are possible, right? Choose the best solution and then implement and evaluate the effect, right? For example, I need to get my car to the service center, right? It is going to take some time and money or insurance and blah blah. That is one part of it. In the meanwhile, it is going to take, for example, 10 days for the car to get back. In the meanwhile, I have to arrange a different travel arrangements. And for that, I need to insure blah blah blah. Right. So this is how you define the problem, identify goals, what you need to do, find alternative solutions, maybe A, B, C, D, E, and then choose one and then implement. That is the problem solving approach to problem solving therapy, and it is usually 6 sessions. It has very good evidence base for depression, for adjustment disorders, and it's typically 6 sessions. Is not required beyond that. Right? Then there are a lot of relational approaches where you talk about cognitive analytic therapy, brief relational therapy. Uh, Here, the primary core or the common thing is two-person psychology. Okay? So, mental health difficulties are considered extremely interpersonal. Okay? One person cannot exist individually, and this therapeutic relationship is both metaphor uh, for and enactment of the problematic patterns. Right? What does it mean? For example, whatever problem we come with into a into a counseling clinic, or for example, we see a psychologist or psychiatrist. So we come with a problem saying that I'm angry or upset. Right? So angry or upset at a person, right? It's very difficult to be angry at your own self until a person is very, very cognitively minded or very, very psychologically sophisticated. They will not identify that I am angry within. They will say, this person makes me angry, that person gets me angry. When I see the face of that person, I tend to get irritable. So it's usually in context of a relationship that people usually express a particular emotion or difficulty. So that is why these two therapies are very much there, but I'll not go into the depth of it. There are very, very brief therapies which are also there. First is motivational interviewing. It's particularly helpful for substance use disorders or when you want any change in your life. That's motivation interviewing. There are some principles for it. Motivational interviewing for substance use disorders is based on the principle. Motivation is a very dynamic or a fluid concept, right? There's a cycle which was given which says the stages of motivation to be pre-contemplation, where you're not even thinking about quitting, to contemplation, yes, I might quit as well. Then you actually prepare to quit when you start planning, like what do I have to do? Do I have to see a doctor? Can I just try quitting on my own? Can I try changing my place or my job? Maybe doing some other activity instead. And then you start taking action and start implementing what you plan to do. And then you actually, if you sustain in the same cycle, you maintain a cycle of remission. But if you again go back to drinking once, it's a lapse, it's a single time, and then it's a relapse if it's more than once or twice, right? So when we talk about motivational interviewing, the first step that we do here is actually, it's like the approach of oats, where we have open-ended questions. Why do you drink? What are the benefits of drinking? What are the harms of drinking? Despite that you continue to drink, you must be getting some benefit. Open-ended questions about it. Uh, then the second is developing acceptance, or the third is R, which is like roll with resistance if the person is not right now not in a state to do it, and S is support self-efficacy, that you are the person who is responsible to get better and you can do it. It is possible for you to do it and you can take the responsibility. That is motivational interviewing, where it is non-directive, non-confrontational. We don't accuse the person saying this is good, this is bad, you have to stop it. That is not usually how we do it. We usually talk about if you want to quit, we are there for you. But let us help and understand why are we continuing despite so much harm. And we talk about the different harms that are already existing. Despite that, the benefits can replace the benefits through some alternative means. That is something that we need to focus on. So, who benefits from brief therapy? It's restrictive view versus liberal view. Restrictive is like people say there is a lot of criteria where we need to be very careful about who we give brief therapy for. So, a person has to be above intelligent, above average IQ, at least one meaningful relationship, can express emotion, have a specific chief complaint, motivated to work hard, realistic expectation, psychological sophistication. That is the restrictive view, which a lot of people usually used to believe in the past. There has to be a criteria to fit to start therapy. But of late, people have started talking about the liberal view, which has been supported by Wilberg and Garfield. And Wilberg says, assume every patient will respond to short-term therapy unless they grow refractory. Okay, and the only criteria it says is the patient does not have to be psychotic. It has to have reality contact, have to have some discomfort, and if they have come to you, that is more than enough, right? So that's like an extremely liberal, but I think a balanced perspective is very, very important. So I'll skip this example right now. So the essential takeaway for practice would be brief is not equal to inferior. There has been strong evidence base. There have been multiple valid approaches that are there. Time is a tool versus constraint. So focus is critical. So what do you want to address is important, because it's a very brief therapy. You cannot just address everything. Be more active and proactive, and it needs you to be more flexible about what kind of approach you want to take. So training matters. So long-term training is not equal to brief therapy competence. Okay, you get specific training for brief therapies if you're willing to actually practice it. Yeah, just I'll pause for a minute. Um, Maybe this is a question for you to think about, the personal reflection. I'll pause for a minute here. So, which approach resonates most with your therapeutic style and why? And which one concept will you apply in your practice this week? Right? That is something that you can think of. And if you have questions, I can take it up now, or maybe I'll just go to the next part of the presentation. Do we have questions? Okay, so no questions. So I'll go to the last part of the presentation. I have only 20 minutes left. And this part of the presentation is actually the one which is the closest to my heart. So I'm basically a psychiatrist. I'll just talk briefly about me and my training, because I think that's also important to understand where I come from. So I'm basically MD psychiatry. So I did my MBBS, that is, and then I did my MD from SW Medical College. I did my Sarship at AIMS Bhubaneswar for 3 years after my MD. And then I did a fellowship in child and adolescent psychiatry from St. John's Hospital, St. John's Medical College at Bangalore. So I have been trained in child and adolescent therapy methods, the assessment, intervention approaches, and perhaps the first in the state for the same. So the next topic is very close to my heart. I had a complete 1-year training in in-depth therapy, so it's very difficult for me to complete whatever I have to say in 20 minutes. However, I just try to give an overview about what are the things that I think are the must, and at least the principles of some of the therapy methods that we have in child psychotherapy. So yes, so I will start with the chapter that has been allotted, which is relevant for your syllabus, is methods of child psychotherapy, and I'll be talking about the evidence-based interventions. So we did talk about the psychotherapy methods for adults. like the psychoanalytic psychotherapy, and we talked about behavior therapy, existential therapy, CBT, and all of that. But when we talk about children and adolescents, we need to be very aware that their cognition is not yet fully developed, particularly before the age of 8. I don't think they have the cognitive sophistication for even a cognitive therapy, right? And second is when we talk about the other forms of therapy like interpersonal therapy. So interpersonal therapy for a child, the primary relationship is with the parents, right? So it's more of family-centered therapy rather than interpersonal therapy when we talk about. And when we talk about what and how we do the therapy, it has to be play-based. It cannot be like an adult sitting in front of you and you're sitting this side of the table and there's a conversation. I don't think that works for children. So it has to be play based, and a lot of play based therapy interventions, particularly for younger children, is a must that we need to understand. And then there is a specific group of therapies called attachment based therapies, because that is something which has been seen particularly relevant uh, in younger children, right? Okay. So what are the approaches that I'll be talking about here is psychoanalytic approaches. What is the relevance for child psychiatry? The second is attachment-based interventions. The third is play therapy. The fourth is parent-child interaction therapy. And the last is DIR. If I get time, I'll talk about it, because I'll skip it. Right? So in psychoanalytic approaches, it's very important when we talk about adults. So there's a psychoanalysis and inner a lot of past traumas. But when we talk about the child, what do we do about psychoanalysis? So it's basically two parts. One is parent-infant psychotherapy, and then MBKT is actually mentalization-based therapies. But this term I got from your reading material, which is possibly a Latin term for mentalization-based or mentalization-enhancing therapies, right? And the core principle here is to focus on early relationships and mental representation. So what I mean by it, I'll tell you. It's like, if we understand what's going on in the inner world of the child, then only we'll be able to help the child, right? So what is mentalization is the child definitely has two modus operandi, right? The first is the equivalent modus, or there is no difference between reality and fantasy. Inside is equal to outside. Okay? And then there is a pretend modus where reality and fantasy exist separately, but they're not aware of reality when pretending. So what does this mean? I'll tell you. So equivalent modus, maybe very young children, if you see, like for example, maybe an infant who is like less than 2 months or so they have just a need of, maybe they need to eat and sleep, right? So they feel that is their reality and there is nothing beyond it, right? So there is no difference between what is inside and outside. It's the same. That is what they feel, right? As they grow older, or as they grow older, they start believing that yes, I can start thinking, I can start pretending, but whatever I pretend is possibly true. Okay? There's no difference between that. But as they grow older, when we talk about pretend play, they start using the phone as a phone, but they know it is not a phone. Okay? So they understand there is a reality, there is a fantasy, but when they're pretending, they consider that to be a reality. Okay? That is the pretend modus. But what we need to do when we talk to children about it, or how we deal with children, is the integration of it is important. Like for example, awareness of pretending while understanding reality. For example, I know my mother sitting right next to me is real. Okay? But when I'm pretending, I'm talking to on phone to my mother. That is something which I'm pretending. So this is real. This is what I'm pretending, and being aware of both of the situations is what is called mentalization. Right. So why is it important? Particularly for a lot of children. Particularly if there is a lot of understimulation, the parents are not available, there's a lot of screen time, right? And then the child goes or withdraws into their own world, where they start believing that is the reality, and the outside reality they're not able to understand. And that is what is how the term autism also started evolving, because people started believing that they are stuck in their fantasy world, right? Although it has a lot of criticism about this particular theory, but that is believed to be the origin about how autism starts with that. Although there is a lot neurobiological correlate to it as well, however, the psychological explanation is based on mentalization. The next, which is attachment-based interventions. So, what is attachment? I'll start about it first. So, there is a child, there is a mother. So, what the child?
Excuse me, madam.
Yes.
Excuse me. Madam, kindly close the class at 11:20 so that other class will be started, sir.
11:30 तो
11:20, you can close the class on 11:20.
11:20.
11:20. After 5 minutes, you can close it.
Okay, I'll do that.
Because the next class will start, sir.
ठीक है, okay, I'll do that. So attachment based interventions, and I'll just skip to the circle of security. Yes. So I think this will be the last slide that I'll be talking about today. The circle of security is when there is a child. So the
Thank
child
you, madam.
wants, yeah, sure. So the child has a secure base where the child needs to go out, explore. Okay. And when the child is exploring, the child wants the parent to watch them, to be happy with them, to play with them, to help them. And then I need you to come and do this. So they welcome you, welcome my coming to you, support my exploration. And then when I want to come back, please protect me, please comfort me, please help me organize my feelings. So the child always wants you to be bigger, stronger, wiser, and kind. Whenever possible, it's important to follow the child's need, and whenever possible, take charge. This is how the child circle of security works, right? So, what happens in young children who do not get to interact with their parents or to form a healthy attachment? So, it's important for their self-regulation, important to decrease threats, right? Important to provide them nurturance. So, people who are faced in foster care, maybe outside or in maybe our centers, orphanages, or who come from broken families, maybe that is the child who needs attachment-based interventions. So children initially communicate more through play than through words. So play therapy and parent-child interaction therapy are very important modalities of treatment, which is which lies in the principle of pride, which is praise, reflect, imitate, describe, and with enthusiasm. So if a child does a good behavior, praise them. Reflect, this is what you did, I'm really happy for it. Help them imitate, do something if you want them to replicate, describe what they're doing, and always lead with enthusiasm. So yes, so maybe this is the last slide. So case one. So if there is a child who is 6 months in a foster care, disrupted early attachment, what form of therapy would you use? I'll give you the answer because we need to close early. So maybe this child will need an attachment-based intervention. The second is this is a child with trauma difficulty distinguishing reality from fantasy. They will possibly need a mentalization-based dyadic therapy. A 5-year-old child with severe behavior problem, parent-child conflict. So maybe this particular child will need attachment-based interventions as well, and parent-child interaction therapy also. And the 7-year-old child with autism spectrum disorder will need a combination of play therapy, will need a combination of parent-child interaction therapy, occupational therapy, sensory integration therapy, and lotus stimulation. Right. So the key takeaways is it's important to match to the need. Children or child therapy-based interventions are usually family-centered. They're relationship-focused, and there is a lot of evidence for it. Integration is the key. Okay. So with this, I come to the end of my talk. Thank you so much. I can take up questions if you have any. Otherwise, we'll close in maybe 1 or 2 minutes.
Madam, thank you so much. So beautifully, you have prepared the PPT. Just I wanted to know, is it possible I'll get the PPT in any source from like from your mail ID or something else so that I
Yeah,
can
yeah,
get
sure.
it?
Maybe I'll share it with your principal and the course coordinator. You can collect it from.
Yes, yes. Please you provide to coordinators, sir.
Yes, sure.
So accordingly, okay. Thank you, ma'am.
Okay. Thank you so much.